Welcome to Human Design Catalyst, Monday, May 6th. Excited to continue our exploration of base theory. Thank you, Lisita, and thanks to Genoa for suggesting as well, and for the feedback from last week. Very cool transcription you did, Lisita. Thank you for that. I don't know what magic that was, if there was some AI involved or what, but
yeah, it was completely AI.
I was
Yeah.
blown away. I've never seen AI be that good. I've never seen it.
It
It's
was
good.
it's
Yeah.
it's the program called Fireflies.
Mm.
Yeah.
I was really impressed. So I want to start using that more. So the idea today is just to kind of continue our exploration of base theory. And I want to look at some of the keynotes because we didn't really look at the keynotes hardly at all last week. What we did last week was we kind of started from the microcosm of subjective human experience, that each of us has this personality that can kind of move into memory or move into the physical or move into the unconscious dream world or move into, well, movement itself, dancing and so on. And then we kind of zoomed out and we looked at the more evolutionary perspective, how throughout history there's been a movement or an evolution where we each have kind of different roles in the totality. So today we're going to start looking at the keynotes, and then I want to look at what Ra called the 10 goads of humanity. And the 10 goads of humanity were his term for what he saw as 10 core conflicts between different bases. And so I don't want to do all the keynotes because I think if we do all the keynotes, we'll just get exhausted. It'll be keynote-itis. You know what I mean? There's so many. There's 5 microcosmic and 5 macrocosmic keynotes for each of the 5 bases. So we're talking 50 keynotes. And I think if we continue the base series, which I'm happy to do, maybe we'll just tackle one base each week moving forward, because even just those 10 keynotes, these are so densely packed, they take a while to deconstruct. And I think if we try to do more than one base at a time, not for today. Today we're going to look at kind of the goads and kind of continue looking at all the bases together. But moving forward, I think that'll be an advantage to kind of spend a week on base 5, spend a week on base 4, things like that. So that will allow us to really savor the keynotes and not get keynote indigestion or keynote-itis from too many keynotes. So, and good to see you, Casey. I see you on the video now. Okay, I'm finding my notes. All right, base theory. I keep everything in my notes app, and someday I hope to move some of this out into, I don't know, books or PDFs or something, because right now it's just thousands of pages of my notes. All right, so I'm in my base theory notes, and I just want to talk about this idea of goads. And basically, I guess we are going to have to use keynotes for this. So, yeah, it is going to be tricky. I'm trying to think of the way to introduce the keynotes. Maybe we'll just do between base 1 and base 2 today. I think that would be good. I think we can handle those. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and the keynotes that I have here. Oh, this is such a small graphic. Let me see if I have a larger one. I apologize for the delay here. Well, this might be it. You know, I may have to, if you give me just one moment, I'm going to actually see if I have the keynotes in a larger graphic. I'll go ahead and share these. It's going to be too small. Okay, I can find it. I can find them. One moment, please. So, all right, I'm going to just reference my copy of Base Theory and find one of Ra's original graphics that hopefully is considered fair use for educational purposes at a small resolution. So I always try to make my own graphics when possible. Okay, let me see. Yeah, I had this. It's just so small that it's just kind of annoying. Well, you know what? I might just retype them. I'll just retype them. That's what I'll do. So it'll take me just 1 minute here. Apologize for that. Base theory keynotes, and I guess I'll explain. I'll say them as I'm typing them, so we can ponder as we go, and then I'll share the screen once I finish typing them. So we're going to start by looking at base 1 versus base 2, and this produces 5 of the fundamental goads of humanity. And what Ra means by goads are just basically the real problems, the real conflicts, the true antagonisms that are present in every great, or in different great stories, masterpieces, works of art, that Ra really felt that for something to be relevant to humanity, it had to fit in one of these core conflicts. And so we have 5 keynotes for each of the bases at a microcosmic level. That's what we're going to be looking at today. And the base 1 and base 2, there are conflicts between those 5 keynotes, and then base 3 and 4 have conflicts between those 5 keynotes. So these are together the 10 goads of humanity, or the 10 real problems of humanity. And so to begin with, we are going to look at base 1 keynotes. And the keynotes that he gives for base 1 are activity, reaction, limitation, perspective, and relation. I know I went pretty quick on those, but we're going to read them in a minute. So activity, reaction. So I guess it makes sense this is the base of movement that we talked about, the kind of double yang base. So this is activity itself, like let's take action to go somewhere else, to go past the frontier. Then reaction. Well, there's a reaction when 2 forces meet. Base 1 is also the principle that no 2 objects can occupy the same place and time. So what happens when 2 people come in the same room? There's reaction. Then it's limitation. It's also the limitation that emerges from that. And this gives you perspective. And from that perspective, ultimately, we have relation. How do I relate to you? It's almost like positionality. And so my notes here are that base 1 is about uniqueness, ultimately, and there are 5 elements of uniqueness. We are unique because of how we act. We're unique because of how we react. We are unique because of the limitations on us. If there were no limitations, we would all be the same. We're unique because of our perspective. We have unique perspectives that only we can see, that nobody else can see. And we are unique because of our relation to others. In relation to others, we are unique. We're different from them. And so Ra says that we can never separate uniqueness from individuality. So this is ultimately about being an individual, and we have the keynotes of individuality and uniqueness as well. And the 5 signposts that a base 1 person is living, and that is base 1 on the personality side, of course, is living their design, is how they act, how they react, their limitations, what perspective they give, and their relation to others. And so Michael Steenbeck-Litvin, he's base 1. So we could kind of see him living his design and really shining in the world as a person because of his unique perspectives. He gives such unique perspectives. People don't really come to me for my unique perspective. I'm base 2. People come to me for my mind. People come to me because I have a memory of things. It's not because of my unique perspective per se. And base 1 is bound to base 2 and needs to be bridged. I'm just going to copy these notes in. And essentially, we're going to look at those bridges. And so I'm going to share my screen in just a moment once I've typed this up. Okay, and now the base 2 keynotes. So I'm a base 2 person. As we saw last week, base 2 is not double yang. It's not just wanting to see what's over the horizon. It's not just the pure movement of life itself, wanting to kind of fill all space and go where nobody's gone before. And I mean, it was a base 1 person who wanted to go to the moon, I'm sure, right? Base 1 is all about, let's go past the horizon where we've never been before. Let's go somewhere new. I'm a base 2 person. That's not who I am. I'm happy to remember. I'm happy to connect to the past. I'm happy to live in the world of mind, because ultimately that brings spirit to people, and it helps their spirit and it helps them. I'm kind of the principal, you can tell if I'm living my design if I help people feel spirited. If they're feeling bummed out in life and then they talk to me and they go, oh, Jonah really brought me some spirit. He brought me, this sense of purpose and things like that. You go to a base 1 to get some interesting perspective. You go to a base 2 because that's somebody who oftentimes has been through a really hard time but kept a positive attitude about it. They can be one of the hardest to wake up to human design because base 2 can be overly positive because it's the principle of mind. It can be overly flippant about the world even, it's the mind. The mind is somewhat incompatible with the movement of life. So base 2, the principle of mind, and let me just type out the base 2 keynotes and I'll say them, and we'll explore these as we go, and then we'll look at the goats. So yeah, I think that makes sense. So we don't get too much in the form of keynotes. We'll just look at base 1 and 2 this week, and then we'll look at the goats between them, and then maybe we look at 3 and 4 next week, and then we'll go into a deeper dive if people are still interested in base at that time, which I hope you are. To me, it's one of the most fascinating things in the world, really. So the keynotes of base 2 are character, like a character actor or somebody who has a strong character, a strong sense of character. Separation, about being separated from the group. Separation in the sense of not being connected, being cast out, cast away, rejected, ostracized, even being, all the ways that you can be separated. Nature, in the sense of what is your true inner nature. Ra did not mean, he actually kind of really had to correct this keynote. He said he didn't mean nature in the sense of some idea of being at one with nature. He meant your true nature. Are you good-natured? Are you ill-natured? What is your nature? Do you have a temper? How is your temper? Like even the idea of temper, it comes from blacksmiths tempering things, blacksmiths banging on things, and the tempering of it, tempering the metal, making it stronger by what it's lived through. Because the mind, of course, is this memory that only accumulates and builds up, so it retains everything it's been through, and what it's been through tempers it and reveals its true nature. Very alchemical theme here. And then the next keynote is integration. So once you've been separated, once you've developed your nature through tempering your nature and so on, then you reintegrate, and ultimately what does that bring? It brings spirit. So I'm going to go ahead and share my these keynotes now, and I'm just going to write them out. It's goads, reaction versus separation, limitation versus nature. Okay, so I know that this is quite a technical topic, but we're just going to take all the time we need to go through it. Okay, so base 1, the base of reactive or movement. The keynotes are activity, reaction, limitation, perspective, and relation. And these are pretty hard to understand. I mean, Ra doesn't actually give us a lot here. I'll tell you a little bit about what he's given us. So this is from Ra. Base 1 is the first orientation, the orientation to be separate in movement, and to be a binary separation in movement, reacting, programmed. And everyone who carries the first base, every crystal that operates through the first base, he means on the personality side here, this is what it is putting out. Like zillions of projectionists in which, as a bystander, you see the illusion of life. So what is it putting out? It's putting out the orientation to distinguish yourself through movement. And so it's a very dense, abstract way that he's describing it here. But principles like the fact that two things can't occupy the same space, principles like that life has to continue moving, that lack of movement is death, lack of movement is stagnation. So last week when we looked at this at the microcosmic level, this was moving into movement itself, to where You lose at the extreme, you lose your identity, you lose your memory, you lose everything except for the pure movement, like an athlete or a ballet dancer, or, that's the sort of microcosmic subjective experience of base one. At a macrocosmic level, this was the evolutionary story of basically how people migrated. How did we leave Africa? The diaspora, the great diaspora out of Africa. Well, it was base one people who wanted to do that. And so they had an orientation to separate themselves in movement. Now, of course, he uses the keynote of separation for base two. So we have to be careful about what he means by it here. In base two, he means the separation of being alienated or rejected, like Jesus's 40 days and nights in the desert or something like that. Here, he's talking in this first orientation about this just basically uniqueness. Some of the keynotes here, individuality and uniqueness. So everyone who carries that first base is putting out the orientation to be separate in movement. And then he talks about the symbol here. It's very small. Maybe I can make it larger, but I guess not. So the symbol is actually the opposite of the juxtaposition symbol. The juxtaposition symbol is the black triangle and the white triangle with the long sides touching. Here we have an hourglass symbol. And my note for the hourglass symbol is it's not the symbol of juxtaposition, which has the long side of yin and long side of yang touching each other. Here, yin and yang do not touch, or they only touch in an infinitesimal point. And this symbol was given to him by the voice. I definitely think it's worth pondering. It's worth pondering, what does it mean that this is not juxtaposition? Juxtaposition is kind of like the meeting or overlap of the two. This is the two that can never overlap. They can only react. This is the principle that you and I can't occupy the same position, but if we meet, there will be a reaction from our meeting. There will be a limitation that we impose on each other. We can't just be free to be ourselves because we have to take into account our neighbors. That's one of the main reasons the base one would leave. They don't like their neighbors, That's why people have, immigrated and gone to different places and so on. My note continues, this is the law of separateness, that two separate entities cannot occupy the same space at the same time, and that everything that exists is in movement. To exist is to be moving. So this is the law that the only thing that does not change is change itself. This is the fundamental law of change. The law that everything has to be constantly moving. And even though we can't occupy the same space at the same time, we can occupy the same space at different times. And so there is this reaction and pushing and moving each other out of the space and so on. It's also the rule of no choice. This is where no choice comes from. And that means that there is no such thing as action. There is only reaction. All the activity that we see is ultimately reaction. There's no such thing as action. From the very beginning, it's all been reaction. Everything reacts, even for manifestors. There is no doing, there is only being done. So, this is a deep philosophical idea, right? This is kind of this idea that everything, starting with the Big Bang, that was the only true action. Even that could have been a reaction for all we know. It was a reaction, two things meeting and reacting when they hit. I have a quote from Ra here. Think about the beginning. The Big Bang is an explosion. An explosion, probably the equivalent of a zillion, gazillion atomic bombs. You know what I mean. It's one of those kinds of explosions that is absolutely impossible to imagine. The heat of that explosion is impossible to imagine. The speed of its movement. And that movement is a movement that moves out in every direction. There's a certain imbalance to it, like with all explosions. There's more density in certain places than others. But generally speaking, this is just a huge blowout. And this is the fundamental origin of movement itself, that we've been moving ever since. That movement of that explosion, this is how Ra describes base one at the absolute macrocosmic level. Now, base one has a relationship of opposition to base two, but it has an affinity with base four. And today we're going to be looking at the opposition more. That's what he would call the goads of humanity. The reason it has an opposition, let me see if I can see if I can share this other screen here. Let's see. I just want to show the base mat. Here it is. So, okay, 1 second here. So we have two different base mats, what are called base mats, which show the positioning of the bases, one for the personality and one for the design. And there are some very interesting points just about studying the difference between the two. For instance, that what is at the heart of the personality is base 5, space, or the heart of the personality base is the personality itself. At the heart of the design base is the body, base 3. And that's why we spend so much time talking about the physical and the body, and also why the design is kind of conflated with the body in certain ways. We also see that in the two different base mats, the personality base mat here and the design base mat on the left, that bases 2 and 4 are in the same position. And I touched on this last week when I pointed out that Ra said base 2 and 4 people are the hardest to wake up to human design, because they're both the personality and the design, they're in the same position. So essentially, if you're a base 2 person, you kind of don't have as much friction between your personality and your design at some simple level. Similarly to how Ra said, if you have the same color motivation for your personality Sun Earth as the color of your determination on the design Sun Earth. It's very rare. It doesn't happen very often. It's much more common that they're off by 1. Only, I think, 1/12 of the color is actually the same like that, or maybe it's 1/6. But either way, it's a smaller subset of people. But if you have, color 3 on the personality side, desire, and then you have color 3, thirst on the design side, that would be a similar sort of configuration to being a base 2 or a base 4, only in the sense that Ra hypothesized that you would have less friction between the personality and the design, but that most people, if you're one of the other bases, you do have that friction. And so when you come to human design, it's easier to get into it because it's giving you answers to why you've dealt with this friction and this resistance, because there's kind of a mismatch. Your personality is trying to live one kind of life, but your design wants a different kind of life. But for me, being a base 2 person, I did not have much of that friction, and I did not relate to a lot of the negative stories that I'd heard about how bad it is to not live your design. I was kind of like, wow, I'm not living my design and I haven't had any of these problems. I feel great. Well, I'm base 2, the principle of mind. It took me a long time to get into human design. I'm glad I did. And then, as we talked about last week, Ricky, being base 4, I just encourage base 4 people to be creative with it, because base 4 really isn't here to pick up somebody else's design system. They're here to design one themselves and to design a life that works for them. And if a base 4 person is good enough at it, they can design it so well that everyone does exactly what they want, what the base 4 person wants, that is, without knowing it. It's just designed that way. So, but anyway, you can see some of the mystery of how bases 2 and 4 are in the same position on either side. And we got on this whole thing just to show essentially the diagrammatic of why base 1 and 2 are opposed. Now, this is on the personality side, they're opposite. You can see base 1 to base 2 is opposed, base 3 is opposed to base 4. They're not opposed on the design side, but that we're using the personality mat as kind of the primary mat here. And we're talking about the personality base anyway. So when I say someone's base 1 or base 2, I mean their personality base. I'll just leave this up for a moment while I read the next part so we can kind of ponder on it. So let me get back to, okay, so base 1 has the relationship of opposition to base 2, as we can see, and then a relationship of affinity to base 4. That was kind of another interesting point, and I don't exactly know what Ra meant by the affinity there. We can ponder what base 1 has to do with base 4, but ultimately this is just kind of one of the open questions that I've noted. A base 1 movement person cannot access a base 2 person who is, evolution or mind directly. Base 1 only leads to being or design. So as you can see, movement can't access the mind or evolution directly. It has to go, it can access design or it can access being. And I was touching on this last week by saying that this is where strategy and authority ultimately comes from. The fact that the mind can't directly access the movement of life, so it has to access either the body or the design, which is the sort of inner imaginative capacity or the dream world or things of that nature. Which, as I mentioned last week, we tend to conflate the body and the design, and I think that's because body is the center of the design base. This whole thing is the design side, and the body is kind of in the middle of it. That's, part of that conflation. So a base 1 movement person cannot access a base 2 evolution person directly. Base 1 leads to being and it leads to design. Both being and design can lead to evolution, but movement itself cannot access evolution. And yet, in another sense, quoting Ra, out of movement comes evolution. So weirdly, in one of Ra's formulas, he said, really the formula is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So it's not like a crazy formula. 1, movement. From movement comes evolution. After the movement, after the people have gone to the new place, then we start to build the hierarchies there, the social structure, and we start to evolve there. Out of that evolution comes being, and out of being comes design. People live there, they have to get along with each other, then we have to design systems. Let's put schools in. Well, what happens if someone commits a crime? What is a crime? We have to design laws, all this stuff. And then ultimately, out of that emerges the illusion of space, the Maya itself. So that's a direct quote from Ra. I'll post that in chat here. And I see your comment there, Rachel, being base 2. I'm also base 2. If you're isolated and cast out as a base 2, you're living your design. Well, you're living your design if you're isolated and cast out, or you have a lot of hardship and difficulty, and you maintain a healthy spirit and are able to reintegrate with people without a chip on your shoulder, without road rage, stuff like that. So, and we can look at base 2 in a moment and dig into those keynotes a little more. Ra also says base 1 is where time originates, and that's why it kind of had to be first. There's no way for anything else to even occur until we have time. It's like you're building the universe. What is one of the first ingredients you put in? Well, you add movement, because movement allows us to have time. Time is rooted in movement. And he also says that base 1 has a special relationship to the magnetic monopole, because the magnetic monopole is the counterbalance to and coordinator of movement. So that's kind of an interesting way of describing the magnetic monopole. Coordinator of movement makes sense, but the counterbalance to movement is kind of an unusual way of describing it. All right, so now I'm going to jump over to base 2 keynotes and read a little bit that we have there, and then we're going to look at the goads between base 1 and base 2. So base 2, evolution and mind. It's the most receptive to base 1 and most received by base 3. What an interesting comment. Like, I guess that's kind of why, even though it's in opposition, it's so weird. Why would it be? And I guess we didn't cover that either for base. 1 second here. I want to just compare my notes. I have two notes open. Okay. Where was its connection to base 4 though? Base 1. Here we go. Okay, this is what I was looking for. So weirdly, base 1 has a relationship of opposition to base 2. This is something that Ra states directly, but it also is the most received by base 2. And these are just straight from Ra. So, I mean, your guess is as good as mine there. I guess I could say maybe it's received by base 2 in the sense that base 2 requires base 1 to have already occurred. When we looked last week at the sort of evolutionary story of it, Base 1 is this diaspora that goes over the farthest hill to define a new name for a location, but they're not interested in staying there. They just want to go on to the next place. And so then the base 2 people come, like me and Rachel, and we say, okay, cool, this is a cool place. Let's build a hierarchy here. Who's in charge? Let's divide the labor. Who's gonna cook? Who's gonna clean? Who's gonna do this? Who's gonna do that? And we kind of, the base 2 is, we receive base 1, even though we're opposed to it, because base 1 keeps on moving and base 2 is like, no, we're going to stay here and build now. It's time to build. We don't want to just keep trying to find a new place. We're going to stick around and actually build something. But I guess that makes us, we receive the base 2. Sorry, I got that backwards. Most received by base 2. Just a second. I'm trying to understand what that means. I think I must have made a typo here. Most received by. No, I guess so. Yeah. No, I just got it backwards in my head. Us base 2 people, we receive base 1. Like, we receive in the sense that they do all this work and we're like, cool, we'll take it. Hand it over. Hand over all that work. Oh yeah, you defined this new place? Sure, we'll build it. We'll build it up. So, but it's just interesting. It's just interesting the way Ra describes it, as like base 1 is opposed to base 2, and yet base 2 accepts and receives base 1. So interesting keynotes and quite mysterious. Okay, so looking at base 2 now, we are opposed to base 1, and yet we are, I see, we have a relationship of affinity to base 3, and we're most received by base 3. So that's also kind of a funny like mismatch here. Like, it's not like there's some simple formula. Base 1 happens first. We define a new place, we give it a name, we kind of demarcate it and say, this is our boundary, this is our location. And then base 1 is like, all right, my job's done. I'm going to go leave and go climb a mountain somewhere. And then base 2 says, okay, we'll start building things. We need hierarchy. We need to know who's in charge. We need a division of labor. We need a caste system. I mean, however it is, right? This is all base 2 stuff. And so base 2 then comes along, we receive everything base 1 had, but then we have a strong affinity with base 3 being, which is also just this principle of how do we all get along with each other? How do we all peacefully coexist? And base 3 actually receives the work of base 2. It's like this handoff, this passing of the torch. Base 2 is like, I've set up the hierarchy. Here's the shaman. Here's the chieftain. Here are the soldiers. Here are the farmers. We've made all the roles. We've figured out what our role is. Basically, base 2 is almost like the principle of profile. What's so cool about studying base is that you actually see how every different part of human design, whether it's profile or in profile and incarnation cross, or the centers, or strategy and authority, or type, or any of this stuff, it all comes from base. Like, base is the originating source of all of these things that happen mechanically in human design. So just like I was showing how strategy and authority is really about the mind accessing movement through the body or the design, similarly, we could say that base 2, there would be no such thing as profile if there wasn't base 2, because base 2 is about the division of labor and the roles. And so it makes sense that these are received by base 3, because everybody can easily get along when they have roles. When you have role confusion, that's when animals fight. They don't know who the alpha is. When you have role confusion in a job, people are getting really mad at each other because they don't know the roles. There's no division of labor. So I think what it's really saying is that base 1 has to be done first for base 2 to begin. Base 2 then has to be done for base 3 to begin, and so on, in this kind of story of the progression of what is needed for the world to work. So here's some of the notes I have. We can never separate role from the mind. Base 2 is about role. And the 5 elements of role are character, separation, nature, integration, and spirit. These are 5 signposts that a person with base 2 for their personality crystal is living their purpose. So a base 2 person is living their purpose when they exhibit an exemplary character, when they are able to separate themselves from others and withstand that sort of separation, when they have a good nature and they don't have a nature that's quick to anger or quick to lose faith or lose hope or quick to give up or any of these things. And when they're able to reintegrate with others, even though they have been separate, and ultimately they're able to exemplify spirit. You can really tell if they have their spirit crushed, well, they're probably not living their design. They're here to have a strong spirit that can't be crushed. If you've seen the movie Cool Hand Luke, he was an example of a person who they couldn't crush his spirit. They had to kill him to crush his spirit. Same thing with One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Jack Nicholson's character, he goes into a highly oppressive place, Nurse Ratched, all this stuff. They couldn't crush his spirit. So these are base 2 stories. This is what base 2 is all about, the uncrushable spirit. And ultimately, it's also the mind. So you can say, you could recognize a base 2 person by that they're really living their design because of the brilliance of their mind. They just have a brilliant mind. These are people you go, wow, that person has such a brilliant mind. Doesn't mean that they have the most unique perspective. Someone like Mike, my good friend and base 1 counterpart, will never understand each other. He and I are about as far removed as you can get in most issues, and yet endlessly fascinating to each other. He's fascinated by my mind. I'm fascinated by his perspective. I don't have the unique perspective he has on things. I exemplify the power of the mind, which is kind of anti-human design, right? That's why it's so hard for base 2 people to wake up to it sometimes. Which doesn't mean that we won't learn everything about it. I just mean it's hard for us to actually live our strategy and authority, or it can be, because we're so fascinated by all the shiny things in the world of mind, and we can endlessly learn about it, but learning about it and living it are different. And ultimately, to live it is a base 1 thing. To live it is ultimately whatever your base is. It's being in touch with the movement of life and being in touch with change. The mind wants to freeze and pause everything. It wants it to not change. It wants to have a frozen view from above, a God's eye view that can see everything, at once. And that's just not how it works. The mind is ultimately, the mind developed as a way of freezing time. So that's why it's hard to think sometimes if there's a lot of movement. There's jackhammering going on outside and you have a hard time thinking because the mind wants to pause the movement. And by pausing the movement, it can create a space where time no longer exists. And so the principle of mind is always going to be opposed to the principle of movement, which is life itself. And the mind is never going to be able to make the right decisions for us because it's making decisions based on old data. It's making decisions based on top-down processing and assumptions and things that it's learned. The mind is what accumulates, it learns. But like we saw last week, Ra actually says the reason we have to die and the reason we have a reincarnational process is because of the mind. None of the other bases have this problem, but the mind only accumulates. And so it can't really unlearn what it's already learned. So we just have to die and come back with a fresh memory bank for a new life. But even then, of course, we still have access through Akashic records and however you want to call it. There's still, it's never really lost. There is a sort of an ontological memory or an external memory there. I'm just going to read a little quote from Bergson, from Henri Bergson, who's one of my favorite philosophers. This is actually a description of Bergson by Christian Kerslake in his book, Deleuze and the Unconscious. And this is a great little quote here. So this is Christian Kerslake's Deleuze and the Unconscious, 2007. And he's describing really how the mind emerged, how the mind evolved. I'll go ahead and paste this into the comments as well. And, I said my message is too long. Okay, just a minute here. And then I'll read this aloud because this is a very fun quote. And even though it's not from a human design person, I think it's quite relevant to understanding how the mind works. And it also relates to the mind's relationship to movement, which we're just talking about, right? We're talking about the difference in the mind and movement. For Bergson and Genet, the human being is an organism that happens to have become complex enough to open up a zone of indetermination. And this zone of indetermination, this is such a great word. I use this a lot actually when talking about how the mind works, and even the illusion of free will or free choice or all of these things. And it's basically that we have become complex enough as organisms. We've become developed enough. We're now 9-centered. Even before that, we were 7-centered. And because we had evolved to this level of complexity, we were able to open up this zone of indetermination in our brains, basically, or really it's our minds, I would say, which permits the suspension of habitual reaction and allows for the appeal to past experience. So what does this mean? What does the mind really do? The mind allows us in this zone of indetermination to suspend our habitual reaction. Well, we already found reaction is base 1. You can see how the mind is opposed to base 1. Reaction is, I'm hungry, so I'm going to eat. The mind is like, that's not your food. You know, look at the animal kingdom. Look at the 5-centered mammals. Mammals are just reacting. You can tell a dog not to eat something and it'll wait patiently and it'll be conditioned not to eat it, and eventually it'll eat it if it's starving. But humans can go on hunger strike. You know, humans, through this power of the mind, are actually able to suspend habitual reaction far beyond what any 5-centered creature can do. And what else can the human do that a 5-centered mammal can't? We can appeal to past experience. Mammals remember. They remember, but they don't appeal to memory. What this means is trying to remember and trying to forget. You don't see a dog going like, I'm trying to forget that. Like, it'll remember something, it'll react to that memory, but it's not there consciously trying to forget something or consciously trying to remember. Like, you can kind of see dogs where you're like, where is it? Where is it? You remember? And it's like, do I? No, I don't. You know, it either remembers or it doesn't. It's kind of simpler in that way. But a human can remember something and be like, oh, I got to forget that, and like try to suppress the memory. Or we can not remember and try really hard to remember and kind of not give up on trying to remember, pushing all this energy towards memory. This cerebral zone of indetermination becomes the gap or interval through which duration enters, proceeding to take charge of the organism and turning it inside out. Time surges into the brain, changing everything, so that now it is the brain which becomes shaped around an ever accumulating ontological memory rather than vice versa. Wherever interiorized duration arises, time pushes through and inverts the fabric of the universe, so that matter must now be taken as the envelope of temporal becoming, rather than time being dependent on matter. This is a fancy way of saying that the human began to shape their world around them because of their involuted or interiorized time. As the mind was able to pause time and create a thought space, it was then able to use this thought space to begin terraforming the world, paving the world. You know, this is hardscape. This is cultivation. This is paving and building and doing all the things that humans have done. Mammals have desire paths. That's the technical name for it. When you see a deer and deer path in the woods, that's a desire path. But no deer is paving that desire path and making a road. You know what I mean? The desire path is the evidence of their movement, but it's a movement that is not being manipulated by the mind. Indifference and repetition, Deleuze makes the Kantian point that a succession of instants does not constitute time any more than it causes it to disappear. It indicates only its constantly aborted moment of birth. Time is constituted only in the originary synthesis, which operates on the repetition of instants. So this is another kind of technical Kantian point, but at the moment that the material universe inverts itself and interiorizes itself virtually, the universe, starting with the brain, becomes shaped around time rather than vice versa. There is an ascent through the involution of virtuality to an entirely new order of validity beyond the order of actual fact. The emergence of memory through the zone of indetermination opens up a process of interiorized differentiation, which proceeds to evolve in tension with the more generalizing tendencies of intelligence. So this is a very technical, philosophical way of kind of approaching exactly what we're talking about here. The difference in base 1 and base 2, the difference between the movement of life versus the mind which references memory and kind of creates this inner space where it can pause things and then begin to kind of manipulate the outer world. It's like we are no longer only reacting to what happens to us. As soon as the mind emerges, at least at the level that it emerges for the, I guess, really the seven-centered being, right? Because mammals have the capacity to plug into a mind, but they don't have the ajna center proper. So when the seven-centered being emerges, the ajna center essentially allowed the seven-centered being to terraform the entire world and transform the world using its mind. And that was really the era of the heyday of the mind. The seven-centered being was sort of the pinnacle of the power of the mind to become the apex predator, to become the sort of dominant creature on the planet. So thank you for bearing with me as we explored that very dense philosophical tract. So now I'm going to return to our keynotes here, having that context. Okay, so we're kind of seeing that the principle of the mind, this is, I'll just read from what Ra here says. Now he looks at this image, and it looks kind of, to me, I always think like a Christmas tree with ornaments. You know, I think of, it's like this kind of, it's an interesting image, right? Like it has little dots on it. And the dots to me, I think of as ornamentation, similarly to how we would ornament a Christmas tree or how we would ornament like bumper stickers on a car, or even like a general will get their badges for what they've done. You know, they get a Purple Heart for valor, or they get their different degrees, or we ornament our walls with art. I mean, we put a placard that says our name on the door, or we ornament the world with all of these things. And that when I see this image, I think of ornamentation, because that ultimately is helping us identify role and all of these things. And here's what Ra says about it. This image is deeply, deeply dualistic. Here's the first place where you can see the associations in terms of the oppositions. It is clear that individuality is a binary and that mind is a binary. So the image for individuality, of course, it's very small up here, but it's that hourglass symbol. And he's saying that it's always going to be binary. And then here too, you can see there's a binary. A distorted mirror, because the points are not exactly the same in them. You have a double point here, and then a single point. On the right side, we have 2 points. On the left side, we have 1 point. And the middle line is not exactly in the middle. It's a little bit up higher. And, so it's this interesting, it's a distorted mirror. The mind is a distorted mirror, ultimately, is what Ra is saying. And what you're looking at here, you have this binary split in the middle. And having the binary split going down the middle, you have the two sides of mind, the upper and the lower. Of course, again, this is the establishment of the dynamics necessary for illusion. You cannot operate illusion without the yin-yang, the this and that. This is the juxtaposition theory. The moment that you have this potential of this and that, everything else can get filled in. In other words, all the other possibilities are there. One of the most interesting things about the roots of mind is that mind is not a singularity. It's not a singularity in the way the body and the ego are. Yeah, it exists in relationship to others, and it has this dualistic quality to it. And then we have the keynotes: character, separation, nature, integration, and spirit. So you can make a story out of them. That to develop character, to learn your character, requires separation, that you don't really know your character until you've been ostracized, isolated. People who grew up in a different country than their country of origin, or from different heritage, people who grew up being kind of outsiders in various ways, having a speech impediment, or having a lisp, or a limp, or any sort of disability, having it's really an interesting question, right? Like, what separates you from the others? Kids can be so mean, making fun of anything that's different, anything that they can to separate the person out from them. And that will ultimately build the character. And then from that separation, you get to discover what is your true nature. Are you actually really good-natured? Are you good-natured even when the whole world is laughing at you and mocking you and people are mean to you? Do you want to get revenge on them, or do you turn the other cheek? That's your nature that you have to discover for yourself. And then once you've discovered your nature, you're able to bring that back and integrate back with society. And what do you bring them? The spirit. You ultimately bring them what we call spirit, which is the enthusiasm. Enthusiasm has an etymological root of being the God within, entheos, right? Like an entheogen as well. So you bring them the inner God that you've discovered in your 40 nights out in the desert after having been thrown rocks at and stuff like that. And so I always think of just when I think of character, I think of like character actors. Like they have a certain thing about them. Like, oh, there's the guy with the eye patch, or there's the guy with the limp, or there's the woman who has the mole on her eyebrow, or however it is, right? That there's something like they're a character. Like if you want to kind of start to see the world through the lens of base, anytime you see someone who's really a character, you can think, oh, that's kind of a base two thing, right? I mean, like I was saying last week about how jazz and blues have a lot of base two in them because a lot of nicknames are a very base two thing, right? You're kind of nicknaming somebody based on some kind of quality of them. Even things like racism and sexism are base two because it's about the hierarchy and the division, and there's really ugly sides of it. But there's also something relieving about someone making fun of you and then being able to be good natured about it and laugh about it and have a good spirit about it and not taking it personally. There's that great scene in Game of Thrones where there's a northerner who doesn't agree with Robb Stark. He's the leader of some other northern house, and he points the finger at Robb Stark and says, I won't follow you into battle. And at that moment, the dire wolf comes and bites off his finger. And everyone's silent and they don't know, is this guy going to fight? What's he going to do? And he looks at it and then he just starts laughing and laughing. It says, okay, I guess I'll fight with you after all. Let's go, And that convinced him. I mean, that's a very base two person. He's just been dismembered and he's laughing about it. Base two is like, are you able to handle all that life brings you and maintain your spirit? Are you able to handle all of the difficulties, all of the pain of life and not get completely dispirited from it? There's a beautiful, beautiful part of Deleuze's book, The Logic of Sense. Gilles Deleuze, who we were reading some of him earlier. We were actually reading Krislaki on Deleuze, but basically very similar philosophical vein. And what Deleuze says, he tells a story of how there was a man in the military and he was drafted and went off to fight in the war. And he lost his leg in the military and he came back. And essentially, the question was how it affected him. Would he then become bitter? Would he become angry? Would he be so mad at life that he only brings an angry spirit with him? Would he basically give up on life? Would he say, poor me, I'm the victim. I was so unfair. I lost my leg and they didn't. I'll never dance again. Would he basically, his body was dismembered and yet the real damage was to his spirit. And then what Deleuze says here is so beautiful. And I think about this a lot. It's a very base two thing. And he says, this man has to become worthy of the event. And anytime something bad happens to you, anytime you become disabled, anytime you suffer great misfortune, you have to rise up to that to become worthy of being crippled. It's such a reversal, right? Instead of, I don't deserve this, I deserve so much better, why did this happen to me? He's like, you're right, you aren't worthy of this happening to you. Your spirit is not good enough to withstand this terrible thing that has happened to you and maintain that healthy spirit. So you can see, I mean, this is a very interesting, deep aspect of what the spirit is really here for. It's here to say, like, when something bad happens to you, like, people who have really easy, good lives haven't had to rise up to any of these events. But if they're really challenged and something really terrible does happen to them, will they rise up to meet it? Will they become worthy of the event? There's another, God, what's his name? So I became friends with a student of Gilles Deleuze, and it was so funny. He was a student of Deleuze in the 70s and early 80s. And right around 1983, when I was born, is when this man, Terence Blake, stopped some of his research that I then picked up and contacted him with my research. And he was like, this is so weird. Like you picked up my research right where I had left it. And I'm like, when did you stop? And he's like, 1983. And I said, well, that's when I was born. So, I just kind of, you passed me the torch, I guess. But anyway, Terence Blake was a student of Deleuze. And so I got to hear all sorts of wonderful stories about Deleuze and about his life. And he had another similar example. I think it was, what's the guy's name? Not Bert, maybe it'll come to me. It's not Bertrand Russell. Not is he had a name like, okay, French philosopher. Well, anyway, yeah, I'm not finding it. It's he's a really, I was look up top French philosopher. It was a really interesting story, so I want to get his name right. Top contemporary. So anyway, yeah, 21st century French philosopher. Oh my God, there's like hundreds of them. Well, leave it to the French. There's just so many. And they all have names that have Bernard in them. Here it is, Bernard Stiegler. Here we go, Stiegler. Yeah, so this guy is so interesting. Bernard Stiegler. I'm going to post his link in here. He's a great example. I mean, I wonder if he's based too. I really wonder if we could find his birth time. Fascinating philosopher, big fan of his work. But what happened is he, in the 70s, ran a top jazz club in Paris. And over time, they were losing money, but he loved jazz so much. It also makes me think he's bass two, because a lot of bass two people really get into, music that's like really a lot of characters in jazz, a lot of characters in blues. And so anyway, he was running this jazz club, and he had to keep borrowing money, and he borrowed money from some pretty shady people. He basically borrowed money from the mob. So he borrowed all this money and couldn't pay it back, and they were threatening to kill him and kill people he cared about. And so he's like, what do I do? And they're like, you can rob banks. We'll tell you how. We'll give you the weapons. So he successfully robbed 3 banks, armed robbery, or he's 2 of them. And on the 3rd bank, he was arrested and put in jail, potentially for the rest of his life. Pretty big blow, right? He had to rise up to become worthy of that event. I mean, that's like a pretty terrible thing to happen. He's this like bohemian dude who just wants to run a jazz club, and he ends up getting arrested and put in jail. And it seems totally hopeless. And it seems like, his life is over for these armed robberies. Well, what does he do? He begins reading philosophy. All he does is read philosophy every day. He starts with Plato and he works his way up. And he just decides, like, well, if I'm going to be in jail the rest of my life, I'm just going to read philosophy then. He kind of rises up to this challenge. And by the 5th or 6th year, he'd become personal friends with Jacques Derrida, the great French philosopher, who appealed to the then prime minister or president of France, I believe, and got him released. And not only was Bernard Stiegler released, he was released as a celebrated philosopher, basically 7 years after getting arrested, something like that. And he was given a job teaching at the Sorbonne, and he was given an apartment. And the rest of his life, he's just been this teacher. It's the best thing that ever happened to him, right? How wild is that? Here's somebody who's like thinking he's going to be in jail the rest of his life. And instead of giving up and just saying, I don't care, he maintained this healthy spirit, and he diligently learned philosophy. And then upon leaving, became one of the most celebrated philosophers of the late 20th century. And he's still around. Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I think a lot of writers are based too. Absolutely, Rachel. I mean, the principle of mind is like the ability to create a world as well. And so these world builders are often based too. All right. So let's look at the goads. I think we've covered the individual ones enough. And I'm probably going to wrap up in about 15 minutes. So we have a little break before our new personality group tonight. But I do want to look at the goads. We can return to them next week if we want. Also, because I think we'll be looking at bases 3 and 4, which are the other goads. So the 10 problems or goads of humanity. Problems or goads of humanity. And this part is pretty mysterious. I mean, it's pretty dense to try to deconstruct this. So let me share what I have here. Let's see. I think I accidentally closed my note. I will grab it. So, I mean, really what we're talking about is the fundamental difference between base one and base two, and how the tension between the two, how movement in the mind will always, like even in that quote I read, the kind of philosophical quote from Kerslake, there was that point where he said, like, the specializing tendencies of the mind will always be opposed to the generalizing tendencies of intelligence. And, philosophers have totally found this stuff. Like, they have found base theory through their own inadvertent means. And I would even go as far as to say that, like, certain philosophers have spent their entire career just on like one of these goats. You know what I mean? Like there's one little tiny corner of philosophy that's completely devoted to the difference in activity and character or something, right? It's like that quote from Ludwig Wittgenstein where he said, language is so vast you could devote an entire career to studying linguistics, only to discover at the end of your life you've only actually studied one room in a vast mansion. You know what I mean? Like, it's so big that you could spend so much time in philosophy being like, this is what philosophy is. And actually, you're just studying like this one way that base one and base two are different from each other. Kind of an interesting idea. So here are the goads. Let me just, there we go. Activity versus character. Let's just go one by one. So activity versus character. I mean, this is a hard, like, I wish we had Ra to like help us develop these keynotes. What does he mean by this? I mean, how is this one of the fundamental problems? I guess the problem would be to really develop your character. I guess it has to do with your activity in some way, but they're also different. It's not like you're, I mean, he's saying that these are real conflicts or problems, so that depending on your character, you will have a problem with certain kinds of activity or not others. Like, activity is what challenges character. If I'm stuck in traffic, the actions of other people are challenging me to be generous and forgiving and not to have road rage. The activity of the world challenges my character. I see people killing each other. I see people drug addicted. I see like pain and suffering. And that activity is so difficult. All the changes in the world are challenging my character. My personal character of who I am as a person is challenged to keep believing in the human spirit, to keep believing in the power of forgiveness, even when I see so many people full of revenge. So the activity is a direct challenge to the character. And can the character withstand those activities, all the things that happen to them, all the movements of life and all of the, changes of life? Even growing old, that's a change. And that is the activity and movement of life. And how does my character develop? In the West, it's so common to get plastic surgery and to hide age and to do all of these things. Something James Hillman said, the great post-Jungian analyst, he said, in the West, we're so obsessed with indigenous people and with other cultures, and it's because we're starved of faces. Our celebrities have so much plastic surgery, we don't get real faces. So we want to look at an indigenous face. We want to look at an African face. We want to look at a face that actually shows this person has actually lived. So there can be this fetishization of the people who are actually showing their true face because they have real character, we could even say. And actually, James Hillman wrote a book called The Force of Character. He might have been a base two person. Reaction versus separation. So the reactions that happen, how do we react to being ostracized? How do we react to being separated from the rest? How do we react to being alienated or isolated? And also, remember that base one is this principle of the reaction when two people meet, what reactions occur. And there will be a separation that occurs from that. And the problem of how do we separate? I mean, separation here is such a dense keynote because remember, base two is also about hierarchies. There's a caste system in India. I mean, there has been, at least. I think it's still around, at least in theory, But there's, this separation, this division that occurs through the reaction of people sharing the same space together. And that itself is its own problem. How are we going to be reactive? How are we going to react to each other? Limitation versus nature. I mean, how do we deal with the limitations placed on us? Life is limitation. We have a limited lifespan. Relationships are a limitation. They're limiting when we're in them, and they're also limited in how long they can last. Maybe it'll last a whole life, but even if your relationship with someone else lasts an entire lifetime, that's still a limitation. And those limitations test our nature, and we develop our nature through how we handle those limitations. Losing a limb, losing the ability to do something we used to do, getting allergies so you can't eat the food you used to eat, having blood pressure or other issues so you have to change your diet, all of these things. How does that affect your nature? How do you handle those things? Do you discover, that you actually couldn't handle them, or do you discover that you're actually stronger than you thought, that you're actually happier than you thought? There's this great quote from the French writer Maurice Blanchot. It's so wonderful. I don't want to mangle it. Maybe I can find it, or I can always paraphrase it. But he writes in The Madness of the Day, La Folie du Jour, how surprised he was at the end of his life to really discover that it wasn't as bad as he thought it was. But rather than it being a delight, he feels robbed of something. His whole life he could complain. And then he looks back and he goes, actually, even on those moments where I felt, and I'll just paraphrase it because I can't find it, but even on those moments where I felt my life was falling apart, even when everything around me crumbled, even in those most terrible moments, I could sit still in the corner of a room and breathe and rest in gladness. And rather than being a comfort, I felt as if something was robbed from me, was stolen from me. My ability to say, look at my hard life, look how bad it was. And he realized looking back that even in those most terrible moments, and he lived through World War II, I mean, he lived through terrible things, but even in those most terrible moments, he discovered that he actually was able to breathe and rest in gladness. And he was robbed of his ability to complain, that he could no longer say he'd had a bad life. And this was at the end of his life looking back. And so I think that's how we discover our true nature. We get to find out what we're actually made of through that limitation. Perspective versus integration. This is really uniqueness versus homogenization. Mind is the great homogenizing force. And when you integrate with others, they change what you've brought them and they homogenize it, and you might lose your unique perspective. I mean, this is a fundamental problem. How does the unique perspective deal with connecting with other people? Ra himself had this problem. I mean, not that he was base 4, but these are just fundamental problems that we all confront in various ways. How could he bring his perspective and not lose it by being diluted through integrating it with everything else? And people want to immediately integrate it. That's what the mind does. It wants to say, oh, I recognize this. What you're saying is that. And it wants to connect it to some other already existing concept, thereby losing the uniqueness, losing the special perspective by collapsing that into integration. So it's a fundamental problem. How do you remain different but same but different? How do you maintain your uniqueness while you also be a part of something else, right? It's like this kind of fundamental problem that we're challenged with. And then ultimately, relation versus spirit. Hell is other people, right? How do we relate and maintain our spirit? And how do we basically, the difference between the individual spirit, or I guess it's not really individual, maybe the shared spirit, and then the individual way of relating, we could say. So it's a similar kind of thing to the perspective integration. I mean, these are all versions of each other, right? These are 5 different ways of phrasing the conflict between base 1 and base 2. And by the way, I'm very open to interpretations here because Ra doesn't give us any. He doesn't give us any interpretations. He gives us the keynotes, and his best advice is to print it out and to study it. So, yeah. The 10 goads of humanity, as Ra calls them. So yeah, if anyone has any comments, anything they'd like to share, any ideas that came up. Otherwise, I think next week, as long as people are still on board with base, I'd like to do base 3 and 4 and look at those goads. And then if we still have more appetite for base, I can start getting into juxtaposition theory and some other things that Ra said. Nancy, I will absolutely share that base recording from last week. I apologize, it's not up yet. I completely rearranged my studio room here, and I have basically been redoing everything. And so I had to kind of tear down all my old computer setup. And now I have a dedicated video editing system. And I even got, it's around here somewhere, I got a snazzy foot pedal with multiple buttons that I can use to pause and restart. And I'm going to be doing a lot of transcription as well. So I will definitely be checking out the service you mentioned, Lisita, as well as any others. I'll just be kind of surveying, but that one was really, really good. And I'll be making those transcriptions available as well for everyone on Signpost. So really appreciate you all. I know this is pretty dense material, but I appreciate your energy and fortitude and coming with me on this journey. And as always, I love to hear anything else you want to talk about, address in future catalysts. But for now, I think we'll just stay the course on base theory and look at bases 3 and 4 next week. Thank you again, Lisita, for all the encouragement in this regard. We wouldn't be doing it without you, and really appreciate, getting, it's a fun topic, and it's one that I personally have found a lot of value from, and I am just glad that other people are interested. It's pretty dense, and so I appreciate all of the cognitive labor. Eat protein. Protein will help with some of the logic. So awesome. Thank you, Rachel. Descript and Fireflies. Yeah, thank you, Lisita. I will look at both of those. So, okay, till next week. Thanks so much.